So, I mean, during the good times, there's a bit of extra cash flow. We pay mortgages down a bit faster, or maybe think about doing that. We make additional repayments. We have a bit more flexibility. But then when there's times where, we've got additional external pressures, what can we do to help with that mortgage expense? What's keeping a roof over our heads?
Yeah, because that's ultimately what we probably our primal fear, right? Like
Yeah.
we'll lose the home over our heads, or we'll have to go backwards rather than take the ground that we've been so fastidious about trying to
Yeah.
do everything right, invest in all the right things, and now it feels like we have to go backwards because this mortgage expense just went way beyond what we anticipated, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So like the thing that I would probably want to start on with this one would be Arnie. Like I'll be back,
Oh,
Arnie,
okay.
but not quite the same spelling. ARNE. This is kind of how I've been thinking a lot more lately, just in acronyms, right?
Cool.
So with the A, it's all about anticipation.
Yep.
When you take out a mortgage, take out more than you need. Take out the more that you need, put it in a revolving line of credit with zero balance or a very low balance, so that effectively you have a free emergency fund, free fund that you can tag
Nice.
later on, right?
Yep.
But it's really hard, like when I'm talking to people about that, it's really hard getting them across the line, because if you don't need it, why should I be borrowing it? And that's why you do have to have some confidence in your own personal finance that you're not going to be spending it on dumb stuff.
Absolutely.
But if you thought that you could do it, then it makes a really good idea, because you don't know what form and what shape problems can happen in the future. Next thing is regulate. So as times get tougher, it's not like instantly we're struggling.
Yeah.
Usually it's like the boiling frog, and you slowly start to notice it, right?
Yeah.
And you're in a different household than I'm in, so I guess with you and your hubby, you would probably have different sensitivity levels to the budget. Would that be fair to say?
100%. Yeah. I think with the regulating lifestyle expenses, for example, I'm the one that looks at money most. My husband just spends it and thinks you get more later. But I've started noticing things creeping up, and just where you can kind of trim that back. Or do we really need to spend $300 a month on coffee? Probably not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's like the simple sort of, regulate yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's what we teach our kids, right?
Yeah,
Just try to control yourself a little bit every now and then. But what are some of the lifestyle things? So there's flexible expenses, and then there's fixed expenses. So if you notice things are starting to get a little bit harder, being really responsive to that and regulating your expenses, that's the first thing to do. Then we move on to negotiate. So this is in the context of things getting a little bit tougher financially. We want to anticipate, regulate, then negotiate. So with negotiate, what I mean here is that there's some requests that you can make to the bank, things that you could do. Like if you were catching things well in advance before you need help, you can potentially get help. For example, we might think of having a child in a couple of years' time. Well, that would be a really good time perhaps to do the renovations that you think you might want to do before the child comes along, or before you're even pregnant.
Yeah.
Because you do kind of have to disclose that to the banks, and they
Yes.
do kind of take that into consideration, right?
Yeah.
And then last step in this process is the E, exit. This is pretty full on.
Yeah.
So when things are getting tough, or you think things are going to get real tough, this is where you either change your mortgage provider, if that's an option, and that's usually not an option when things are really bad,
Right.
or you exit. And by exit, I mean you exit the house.
Right.
Is there a way that you could become a rent investor, move out of it, get a tenant in there, pay rent lower somewhere else, or do you have to sell? Way better selling before you're actually going through the financial pain than when you're going through it, because it's just one other thing.
And I guess there's less emotion involved when you're right at the
Totally
prickly end. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess before you get to negotiate, exit, the prickly end of those pieces, you would probably need to go through the anticipate and regulate stage regardless, because you're going to have to show to the bank that you've tried. You've made some steps.
Yeah. And this is where like the steps that you could take would be simple things like, depending on how you've set up your mortgage, if you're overpaying your mortgage, and overpaying your mortgage just means that you're paying off larger amounts of principal than you need to.
Yeah.
So if you're overpaying the mortgage, in some cases, you'll be able to dial that back. If you've fixed your mortgage, you might have to wait till the fixed term expires before you can do it. But in other cases, depending on your structure, you can just dial that back. If you have some savings or revolving line of credit that you could access, maybe there's a way that, again, sticking to a budget and a plan, maybe there's a way that you can consume that for the period of time that you think this strain will last for. But ultimately, what you're trying to do is you're trying to demonstrate to the bank that if you do need to go to them and negotiate quite seriously, you need to be able to demonstrate that you've actually done all these things. Like you've trimmed your budget, you've canceled the Netflix, you've spent some of your savings. Obviously, we don't want to be too vulnerable to the bank because they're not always going to be your best friend here. They just want to get their money back. But we need to demonstrate that to the bank. Otherwise, they're going to have trouble believing you if you're going to them and you're saying, hey, help, I need help here.
Yeah. There must be a fine line to walk, right? You're going to them saying, I need financial help, but I'm still in a position to be able to repay it if you help me.
Yeah, it's a really weird tension.
Yeah.
And this year, unfortunately, we've become quite good at counseling people through this tension.
I've heard a lot on the phone calls. Yeah.
And it's hard because the reason why people are asking for some help is because they're feeling the pressure financially. But when we go to the bank wants to know, well, what kind of request is this? Is this a request made out of a position of strength and confidence? Or is this a request made out of desperation?
Yeah.
And if it's the latter, if it's desperation, great news is that there are levers that they can pull, but you need to be really clear with them what levers you want pulled, and you need to be really honest about the position that you're really in.
Yeah, that just sounds scary. Can you use an advisor to help you with that?
Yes, you can. You can. And maybe what I'll do is we'll just go through a few of the requests that you can make. One of them is that you can make a request for interest only.
Okay. So what does that mean?
So interest only is when you make a mortgage payment, there's always two components to your payment that you make back to the bank. There is a little bit of the principal or a little bit of the amount that you borrow back from the bank, and then there's a whole lot of interest or like rent for using that money.
Okay.
So if you go on interest only, you're just saying, hey, for a period of time, I don't want to pay that principal bit. I don't want to pay that part. I just want to pay interest. Often people call it interest free. Not really technically interest free. You're not going to get that from a bank, but you can go interest only for a short period of time.
Okay.
And if it's the home that you're living in, you can generally get up to 2 years, depending on the bank and depending on the reason why you're asking for it. If you really need it, you might only get 3 months.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it's to do with the fact that we talked about before, whether you're coming from a position of strength, i.e. you don't really need the bank, you just want them to give you interest only for some financial reason, or you need interest only because you're struggling to make your payments. They'll throw you a lifeline, but it's usually a really short lifeline. It can be longer than 3 months, but more often than not, it's just 3 months.
Okay.
And they want to know what your plan is, how you're going to get through this. Yeah. Wow. So you just have to be careful with all these sorts of things that it's not the magic bullet, right?
Yeah.
Like you're just paying the interest only, but the interest is often like 80%, 70 to 80% of your payment.
I was going to ask what kind of discount are you going to get here on your mortgage repayments?
It's not massive.
Right.
And it's not like that principal has gone. It's still there. You still have to, and when the bank, when that interest only expires, that period of interest only expires, you're still paying off your mortgage, right?
Yeah.
So it's just a temporary fix. The next thing you can do is request what's called a mortgage deferral.
Is that when they wipe your mortgage?
That would be great.
Yeah.
Or it used to be called the mortgage holiday.
Ah, okay.
Right.
Yes,
so
yes.
This is where you just go away on holiday. Yeah. Don't have to pay your mortgage, right? It's great. Unfortunately, it's not like that. So what a mortgage deferral is that they take the principal and interest payment and then they add it to your mortgage balance. So if you have a $500,000 mortgage payment and you have to pay $5,000 a month, they'll give you potentially up to 3 months worth of deferred payments. So they'll pause your mortgage payments for 3 months, $15,000 there. They'll add it to your 500 mortgage. So you have a 515 mortgage.
Just tack it on the back.
Tack it on the back.
Wow.
You do pay more in interest as a result because now your mortgage balance is higher when that holiday or that deferral period ends. But it's a great way of just taking immediate pressure off. And 3 months isn't very long, but it's also sometimes long enough to get your ducks in a row.
Yes, yeah. And with that kind of request, that again, is that one of those ones where you kind of have to walk the very fine line between?
You do, yeah. So if you make a request for that, you generally have to kind of say, hey, why?
Yeah.
When we went through that period of lockdowns and there was, like they actually extended it to 6 months and they lowered their criteria in terms of being eligible for it.
Right.
But now you do have to usually fill out a one-pager talking about your assets, liabilities, income, and expenses, just to prove that, you are struggling. Because what the bank wants to know is, are you asking for a deferral so that you can save for your trip to Spain? Or because, you're generally in a bit of trouble, right?
Yeah.
And the last thing you could do is you could ask for a top up. What a top up is an extra amount that you're borrowing from the bank.
Okay.
And if you ask for a top up, again, kind of like what we've been saying the whole time, is that if you really need it, you're not going to get it because the bank already might be getting a bit anxious that you might be struggling to pay them back.
Yes.
So they're not really going to want to give you even more credit unless it's really, really clear that you've got a plan to get through.
Okay.
That top up, though, could be a good preemptive strategy if you saw maybe just a vague possibility that there could be trouble on the horizon. For example, you know that there might be a roof replacement that needs to happen roughly around the same time that your employment contract might be coming to an end.
Right.
Think about the timing. You need to present to the bank when you don't really need the money, when you're in a position of strength, not weakness.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you're thinking about having a second kid, like you used in the previous example. Maybe get those renos done.
Yeah.
Prior.
Definitely.
Interesting. Okay. So I've also heard on the phone you talking to people about changing banks, getting a bit of a cash sweetener, resetting their mortgages. Is that something that people can do?
Yeah. So typically this happens all around the same time when a fixed interest rate period expires. So a fixed interest rate period expiring just means that this is the period of time which comes to an end where the interest rate that you were paying now unlocks and you need to reset it for another period of time. And in this environment, people are often coming from a very low rate onto a very high rate. And so their payments are going up considerably. Like in a lot of cases, it's 60%, 70%, even 100% higher than what they were doing. So it can be quite a shock. And the natural line of thinking would be, I can't afford this. What am I going to do? How can I get a better deal on my mortgage? How can I get a lower interest rate? I've heard that some banks are doing cash incentives or cash offers or sweeteners to change over to them. Will my bank do that? There's all these questions that come up at the same time. And again, based on the previous parts of our conversation, if you really need it, like if you're really struggling to make your mortgage payments, the issue with changing banks is that that new bank actually has to establish whether or not you are bankable. So if you're struggling to make mortgage payments, considering we're in an environment where the bank's lending criteria is so difficult, you might find that a new bank doesn't want to touch you. And your only option is to stay with your current bank and just accept the best that they have.
Right.
But the idea of changing banks is great if you're coming from a position of strength, but you see that maybe you just want to be proactive here.
Okay.
It's a still good idea because what can happen is you can stretch out your loan term. So we're not talking about your fixed rate term. We're not talking about the interest only term. We're now talking about the loan term, which is the period of time that you're allowed to have a mortgage for.
Okay.
Typically 30 years when it comes out of the box. So, and there's a lot of pros and cons around this. So let's say, for example, you've had a mortgage in place for like 8, 9, 10 years. You have a 20-year loan term left to go. And if your interest rate goes up, that can be like a really high payment.
Yes.
If you change banks, you can reset your loan term up to, say, 30 years.
Oh, wow.
And so that lowers the amount of principal you pay. You're still paying a higher interest rate, but the principal part is going down. You have to go through a whole application process with that bank to get approval, but that can be a really good solution. Plus, there's an opportunity to restructure your mortgage accounts, which I found, to be honest, is probably like, well, that's probably like the best way to save money on your mortgage is just to make sure your setup matches your lifestyle. And you can do a top up at the same time, do all that sort of stuff. So yeah, refinancing or changing banks can be a good solution so long as you're coming from a position of power and not desperation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what happens if you go through this and the new bank just doesn't approve you?
Yeah. The good thing about this is that you've now tested the market so that you know your position. And depending on how you've done it, like if you've talked to a mortgage advisor to do this, they can often actually tell you right away whether or not you're going to get approved with another bank before you even try.
Okay.
You can then go back to your existing bank and see if they'll match the offer that you would have got with the other bank. So for example, at the moment, and this definitely doesn't always apply, you might get a cash incentive from your existing bank just to stay still. They don't do this all the time and every single time, but in some cases, if you know that another bank is doing it, maybe your existing bank will offer it to you just to stay put. And the good thing with your existing bank, unless of course you've submitted an application to them, is that they don't know that you're not bankable because they don't actually assess you.
I was just going to say, do you have to tell them you weren't going to get?
No.
Okay, cool.
So and you are bluffing,
Yeah.
right? You're like, well, hey, I'm aware of what's in the market. You just have to be honest with yourself and know that actually you are actually bluffing.
Yeah.
You're not able to move to another bank.
Yeah.
So you have to be prepared to accept that. But that could be a great way to relieve some short-term pressure by getting a small cash incentive, which might be equal to like one mortgage payment.
Yeah.
That's something.
Yeah.
It's not like a mortgage holiday, but it is free money.
You also feel like you're doing something as well, right? You're being a bit more proactive. You got a bit of control around things that are happening to you. So
yeah. And you're getting advice.
Yeah.
Especially if you come to us, come to a mortgage advisor, because even just talking to somebody and saying where you're at can make you feel better. It can impart some advice, and maybe you were thinking about just going for that cheap 2-year special that you just saw without thinking that the market was about to tank, or you might be doing that and you don't actually have the counterfactual that interest rates are going higher. There's all sorts of advice that can be imparted to stop you from making a bad mistake. And it's just good practice to get advice every time you need to refix.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is we've got a bit of a process to go through if we want to look at helping ourselves when it comes to our mortgage repayment. So to go back to Arnie.
Yeah. Let's go back.
Yeah. We've got anticipate. So what's the summary of that?
Okay. So just, again, think about what are the changes that are coming down the pipeline. How can you anticipate well in advance of those changes happening? Remembering that you always have to disclose to the bank what your, not always, I should say, but if you're asking for help from the bank, you do have to disclose your situation. So if your job has gone away, or your income has dropped, or there's a new big expense that you didn't have before, private school or other things like that, you need to disclose it. And that might mean that you're not going to get any money. So anticipate what's coming up in your life and try to plan for it well in advance of that happening.
And part of that planning, I guess, is regulate.
Exactly. Do the basic personal finance stuff. Do our New Wealth Foundations course. Make sure that you're both on the same page. If you are a couple, get you guys on the same page. Is going to be so easier to get you going forward and going through anything that might be tough times in terms of financial pressure, right? So make sure you got a good, strong foundation there.
Cool. And then negotiate. So some options we've got.
Yeah. And that's where we talk about an interest-only request, a mortgage deferral request, a mortgage top-up, maybe even negotiate a cash offer with your bank after you've talked to an advisor around whether you can get a refinance approved, change banks. So those are all the negotiations that you would do when you either see trouble coming or trouble is actually happening.
And then finally, exit. So is this something that yourself as an advisor can help with as well? Yeah,
well, I think any area to do with property and finance associated with property is on the table for discussion.
Yeah.
Especially when you consider that most of the advisors you deal with, and this is true with mortgage advisors, set up to help you take out debt. Real estate agents are set up to sell you property or sell your property. Who's there to actually tell you about the long-term financial implications of selling or buying? That's where we sit. So before you even get anywhere near that question of exiting, you're thinking of selling because you have to, even because you want to, but because you have to, certainly get some advice, reach out, because selling that property is a massive financial decision, especially when you consider that property markets are cyclical. And when things are down, it feels like it's never going to get better again, but we always get better again. The sun always comes out. So you definitely don't want to have those lettuce hands letting go of your property anytime soon. And then next thing you know, everybody's talking about how things have doubled again.
Boom.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an important one. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for those wise words.
No problem. All right. That's it for this episode, everyone. Thank you for listening in. Hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, make sure you subscribe. We'll catch you on the next one.